The day everything fell apart. Darrell Hayes had never felt the weight of life press so heavily on his shoulders as it did that cold Wednesday morning. The sky was the color of wet concrete, and the wind cut through his jacket like it wasn't even there. For the first time in years, he didn't know where he was going, only that he had to keep walking. His entire life had collapsed in less than a week. His mother's medical bills had swallowed every dollar he saved. His job at the auto shop, the one he poured his sweat and skill into for 7 straight years, suddenly vanished when the owner shut down without warning. And as if the universe wanted to add insult to injury, his landlord taped an eviction notice to his apartment door the night before. He stuffed a couple of shirts, his toothbrush, and his late father's pocket knife, its wooden handle worn smooth from years of use, into an old backpack. Everything else stayed behind. Start over, he whispered to himself as he stepped onto the icy sidewalk. Just, start over. But starting over is easy to say and painfully hard to do when you have no job, no home, and barely enough money for a cup of coffee. He walked toward the city center, unsure what he was hoping to find. At the corner of Maple and 8th, he paused outside a small diner. Inside, people laughed, steam rose from coffee cups, and warmth spilled out every time the door opened. Darrell placed his hand on the handle, hesitated, and then pulled it open. The smell of frying eggs and cinnamon pancakes filled his senses. A bell above the door chimed. A waitress with silver hair smiled at him. "Sit wherever you like, hon." He chose a booth at the back, more to hide than to rest. He ordered nothing he couldn't afford to, but he kept his head low, pretending to study the old menu. After a few minutes, the waitress approached again. "You look like you could use something warm." She slid a full plate in front of him: eggs, toast, sausage. "Don't worry. It's on me." Darrell's throat tightened. He hadn't eaten since the previous afternoon. Thank you," he muttered. She simply pat his shoulder and walked away. He ate slowly, savoring every bite, trying not to look as starving as he felt. When he finished, he noticed a man sitting at the counter. Tall. Slim. Wearing a charcoal suit that probably cost more than Darrell's entire wardrobe. The man glanced back at him once, just briefly, but there was something in his eyes. Like curiosity. Or recognition. Darrell ignored it. He slung his backpack over his shoulder and stood up, ready to leave before the waitress could come back and start asking questions. As he passed the counter, the man in the suit spoke. "You look like someone standing at the edge of a chapter," he said without turning around. Darrell froze. "Sorry." The man looked over his shoulder. His eyes were sharp but warm. "A chapter. One ending, another beginning. Sometimes we need someone to turn the next page for us." Darrell stared at him, confused and slightly uncomfortable. "Do I know you?" "No," the man said. "But I know your look. I've worn it myself." He stood, placed $100 bill on the counter, and picked up his gloves. "Walk with me." Darrell wanted to refuse. The world had not been kind to him, and he didn't trust strangers with expensive suits and cryptic sentences. But something, maybe hunger, maybe exhaustion, maybe fate, nudged him to follow. They stepped outside. The wind whipped at them. "My name is Charles Rendell," the man said. "I used to sleep in abandoned buildings. I used to go days without food. Today I own 3 companies." He stopped at the crosswalk and looked directly at Darrell. "Life turns fast, if you know where to push." Darrell frowned. "Why are you telling me this?" Charles smiled. "Because you look like a man who's ready to push." They walked another block before Charles motioned toward a building made of red brick and glass. A bronze plaque hung beside the door: Rendell Innovations Headquarters. Darrell blinked. "This is yours." Charles nodded. "You walked in with nothing today," he said. "But if you're willing to learn, willing to grind, Willing to show up even when life crushes you. I can show you something that will change everything. Daryl's heart pounded. He didn't know whether to be afraid, suspicious, or hopeful. A job? He asked quietly. No, Charles said. A secret? Daryl swallowed hard. What kind of secret? Charles smiled again, calm, confident, as though he'd been waiting for this moment. The kind that turns nobodies into leaders. He held open the door. Come in. If you step through this door, your life will never look the same. Daryl hesitated only a second. Then he walked in. Daryl stepped through the glass doors of Rendell Innovations, feeling like he had crossed into a different world. The lobby alone was bigger than his entire apartment. Warm lights glowed from sleek modern fixtures, and the polished floor reflected everything like a mirror. A soft hum of productivity filled the air, phones ringing, footsteps echoing, conversations happening behind etched glass walls. He swallowed hard. This was a place for people with degrees, crisp suits, and polished confidence, not a man with a wrinkled jacket and a backpack full of everything he owned. He took a shaky breath, ready for someone to tell him he didn't belong. Instead, a receptionist with a neat bun smiled at him politely. Mr. Rendell, your meeting room is already prepared. Thank you, Elise, Charles replied, as if this was routine, bringing strangers in from diners and treating them like honored guests. Daryl followed him down a hallway lined with photographs, Charles shaking hands with city leaders, workers cutting the ribbon on new facilities, smiling groups celebrating team achievements. There was even a picture of a massive warehouse with the caption "Where the Journey Began." Charles opened a door to a small conference room. It wasn't flashy, just a long table, 6 chairs, and a window overlooking the busy street below. Sit, Charles said, settling into a chair across from him. Daryl hesitated, then took a seat. Charles leaned forward, resting his hands on the table. Before I tell you anything, I need to know one thing: are you someone who gives up easily? Daryl exhaled slowly. If I gave up easily, I'd still be sitting in that diner pretending I wasn't hungry. A faint smile tugged at Charles's lips. Good answer. He reached into his briefcase and placed a small black notebook between them. Its cover was worn at the edges, like it had been carried everywhere. Inside this notebook, Charles said, tapping it lightly, is the reason I went from sleeping under bridges at 21 to running companies by 35. Daryl stared at the notebook. A business idea? No, Charles said. A mindset. A system. A way of approaching life that no one ever teaches you, not in school, not at work, nowhere. Daryl frowned. So why give it to me? Charles leaned back and folded his arms. Because every once in a while, I see someone going through what I went through. Someone who's not broken, just buried. And I know what it's like to stand exactly where you're standing now. Desperate. Hungry. Ready for change. He paused. When I was at my lowest, a stranger helped me. One conversation changed my entire direction. I promised myself that if I ever got the chance, I'd pass the same gift forward. Daryl felt something tighten in his chest. What do you want from me? Effort, Charles replied. Commitment. No excuses. Daryl nodded slowly. I can give you that. Not to me, Charles corrected. To yourself. He slid the notebook closer. Daryl rested his fingertips on the cover. It felt heavier than it looked. Before you open it, Charles said, I need to tell you a little story. Daryl nodded, waiting. When I was 22, Charles began, I worked at a factory in the East District. 12-hour shifts, miserable pay, no future. One night, after a particularly brutal shift, I met a man named Elijah outside a bus stop. He looked me dead in the eye and said, You're living like someone else is writing your life. Why? Daryl blinked. Why would he say that? Because he saw right through me, Charles said. He saw a young man who believed he had no control. A young man who thought life was something happening to him instead of something he could build. He tapped the notebook again. Elijah gave me a set of principles, step-by-step habits that, if followed, would shift my life in ways I couldn't imagine. I didn't believe him at first. But I followed them anyway. He spread his hands. And here we are. Daryl felt the room shrink, his breath tightening as he looked at the notebook again. So this is, the same thing. The exact same system, Charles said. But improved. Refined. Built through years of failure, success, broken bones, broken deals, and thousands of mistakes. Daryl swallowed. What do you want me to do with it? Charles gave a small, confident smile. Read it. Apply it. And come back tomorrow morning at 7. He glanced at Daryl's clothes. Don't worry about what you wear. Just show up. Daryl felt overwhelmed. I don't have anywhere to stay tonight. Charles nodded, as if he expected that. I've arranged something for you. He pulled a card from his pocket and slid it across the table. This is a temporary housing voucher I fund for people who need a fresh start. It's not charity. It's an investment. Daryl froze. He had walked into a diner with nothing, and now someone he'd met 15 minutes ago was offering him a roof, guidance, and a life-changing secret. I don't know what to say, Daryl whispered. Say you'll try, Charles said. Daryl closed his hand around the notebook. I'll try. Charles stood. Good. Your new chapter starts today. As Daryl followed him out of the room, his mind buzzed with fear, hope, disbelief, and something he hadn't felt in a long time, possibility. When he stepped back into the cold air, the notebook felt warm in his palm. He didn't know what was inside. But he knew one thing. When he walked into this building again tomorrow, he would no longer be the same man. The shelter Charles arranged for him wasn't fancy: 4 walls, a thin mattress, and a shared bathroom, but when Daryl closed the door behind him, it felt like the safest place he'd been in weeks. No eviction notices. No cold wind slipping through cracks. No fear that someone had followed him. Just silence. He sat on the bed and opened the small black notebook. The first page held a single sentence. Before you change your life, you must change your days. Daryl frowned. Not what he expected. He flipped to the next page. Rule number 1: wake before the sun. The world moves loudly. To hear your own path, you need quiet. Daryl scratched the back of his head. He wasn't a morning person. Not even close. But he kept reading. Rule number 2: do the hard thing first. The job you avoid is the job that stops your growth. Rule number 3: learn for 1 hour a day. Skills make money. Mindset keeps money. Education builds both. Rule number 4: never leave a day without progress. Even an inch forward keeps you from falling backward. Rule number 5: build discipline, not motivation. Motivation fades. Discipline stays. He closed the notebook slowly. That's it, he said out loud. But no, there were more pages. Stories. Exercises. Challenges. Charts. They asked questions he'd never asked himself. What do you want your life to look like in 1 year? What are the habits that are destroying your progress? What would you do with your time if no one was watching? Some pages felt like Charles had written them specifically for him. The notebook didn't give answers. It demanded them. Daryl lay back on the bed, staring at the water-stained ceiling. The rules felt simple, too simple. But something inside him whispered that maybe simple was exactly what he needed. He set the alarm on the cheap clock beside the bed. 5 a.m. He had never willingly woken up that early. All right, he whispered to the empty room. Let's see. Morning hit like a hammer. The alarm exploded through the room, startling him awake. Darryl slapped the clock so hard it nearly fell on the floor. Everything in his body begged him to go back to sleep. But rule number 1 echoed in his mind. He forced himself upright. His breath fogged the air, the room was freezing. He got dressed, splashed cold water on his face, and stepped outside. The sky was still dark, and the city felt different, quiet, patient, as though it was waiting for him. He walked toward a small park at the end of the block. The cold burned his lungs, but the crispness felt good. Honest. He sat on a bench, pulled the notebook from his pocket, and read rule number 2. Do the hard thing first. The hardest thing he had in front of him was figuring out what he even wanted from life. He had spent years working, surviving, helping his mother. But dreaming? Planning? Building something? He had forgotten how. He stared at the blank page that asked him to write his one-year vision. Minutes passed. Nothing. Then, slowly, words began to form. A stable job. A place of my own. Enough money to help mom without drowning myself. Confidence. A direction. He wrote until the page was full, not with specifics, but with desires he'd pushed down for years. He read them twice. His chest tightened. For the first time in a long while, the future felt like something he could touch. The first test. By 6:30 a.m., he was walking toward Rendell Innovations again. The city was waking up, cars honked, shops opened, people rushed. But Darryl felt strangely calm, as if waking early had given him a head start. When he reached the building, Charles was already inside, pouring coffee from a sleek machine. He looked up as Darryl entered. 5 minutes early, Charles said, smiling. Most people are late on their first day. I didn't want to waste your time, Darryl replied. Good. Because I'm not giving you a job today. Charles handed him a mug. Today, I'm giving you your first challenge. Darryl's stomach nodded. What kind of challenge? Charles motioned for him to follow. They walked into a small studio-like room with a single desk and a whiteboard. Sit. Darryl obeyed. Charles wrote one word on the board. Discipline. This, he said, tapping the word, is what separates dreamers from doers. Then he leaned against the desk. Your challenge this week is simple, follow every step in that notebook. Every rule. Every exercise. No shortcuts. No excuses. At the end of the week, if you've followed it honestly, I'll open the next door for you. What's the next door? Darryl asked. Charles smiled. You'll find out when you earn it. Darryl nodded slowly. And if I fail? Charles shrugged. Then you weren't ready. He paused. But I think you are. Something inside Darryl lit up, small, but powerful. Charles continued, this notebook builds momentum. Momentum builds opportunity. Opportunity builds success. But it starts with you. Nobody else. Darryl tightened his grip on the notebook. I'll do it, he said. Charles studied him for a long moment, then nodded. Good. Return tomorrow. Same time. Darryl stood. I will. Darryl, Charles added as he reached the door, don't try to impress me. Impress yourself. Darryl paused, absorbing those words. Then he stepped out into the cold morning again, this time with a fire in his chest. The notebook wasn't magic. It wasn't easy. It wasn't even comfortable. But it was a beginning. A path. And for the first time in months, Darryl felt like he wasn't walking alone. He was walking forward. Darryl woke up the next morning the same way he did the day before, violently, thanks to the alarm hammering his brain. But this time, something was different. He didn't argue with himself. He didn't groan, roll over, or bargain for 5 more minutes. He sat up immediately. Rule number 1 was becoming a habit. The room was still cold, but he felt warmer inside, like a small fire had begun burning somewhere deep. He splashed water on his face, grabbed the notebook, and stepped outside. The morning air sliced at his cheeks, but he didn't complain. He walked to the same park bench, flipped the notebook open, and began reviewing yesterday's notes. Then he reached the next challenge. Daily challenge: identify one bad habit and replace it. Daryl stared at the page. Bad habits? He had plenty. Avoiding problems. Procrastinating. Overthinking. Shutting down when life got hard. He sighed, picked up the pen, and wrote. Bad habit: freezing when I feel overwhelmed. Replacement habit: take one small action immediately. He closed the notebook. One small action, he repeated. It felt doable. Day 2 at Rendell Innovations. When he arrived at the office, Elise the receptionist nodded in greeting. That small gesture made him feel seen. Like he belonged, even just a little. Charles was already in the conference room, reviewing a stack of documents. Morning, he said. How was your first day? Hard, Daryl admitted. But I did everything in the notebook. That's the point. Growth is supposed to be hard. Charles pushed a folder across the table. Today, your challenge changes. Daryl opened the folder. Blank forms. A checklist. A simple, short reading assignment. Nothing complicated. What's this? A test, Charles said. Not of intelligence, of consistency. You're going to complete these tasks before tomorrow. None of them matter individually. But who you become by finishing them does. Daryl flipped through the pages. I can do this. I know, Charles replied. But will you? The question hung in the air. Daryl took a deep breath. Yes. We'll see, Charles said softly. The slow grind. The next 3 days were the hardest days Daryl had lived through in years. The notebook demanded things he wasn't used to. Organizing his day. Planning meals. Keeping track of every hour. Reading one chapter of a leadership book. Doing 30 minutes of exercise. Writing down feelings he normally avoided. The tasks weren't huge, but they added up. By the time each day ended, he fell onto the shelter bed exhausted. But every morning at 5 a.m., he got up again. Rule by rule. Page by page. Step by step. He noticed small changes. Subtle ones, but real. He walked straighter. His mind felt clearer. His fear wasn't controlling him. He didn't feel useless when he looked in the mirror. And by day 4, even the receptionist, Elise, smiled and said, "You're glowing today." Daryl laughed because he couldn't believe it was true. The breaking point. On day 5, he hit a wall. Physically, mentally, emotionally. Everything felt too heavy. The exercises annoyed him. The reading frustrated him. The self-reflection pages in the notebook forced him to confront feelings he'd buried for years. He slammed the notebook shut. This is stupid, he muttered. I'm not built for this. He threw the notebook onto the bed and paced the room. He thought about quitting. He thought about running. He thought, for a moment, about calling the number on the back of the eviction notice taped to his mind like a scar. Daryl sat on the edge of the bed, head in his hands. This is too much. His heart pounded. Then a sentence from the notebook whispered in his mind. When you reach your breaking point, take one small action. He stood, walked to the bed, and picked the notebook back up. One small action. He opened to the next page. Write a letter to the version of you who wanted to quit. Daryl stared at the blank page. Then the pen moved. I know you're tired. I know life hit you harder than most. But you're still here. You've survived things that would have destroyed other people. If you quit now, you'll go back to a life that never gave you anything but pain. But if you take just one more step, you might reach something you've never had hope. Tears hit the page before he realized he was crying. He kept writing. He didn't stop for a long time. When he finally closed the notebook, he felt lighter. Not healed, but lighter. The end of the week. On the 7th morning, he stood outside Rendell Innovations a few minutes before 7 a.m. He clutched the notebook tightly. Charles greeted him with a nod. "You look different." "I feel different." "Good," Charles said. "Did you follow everything in the notebook?" "Every step," Darryl answered. "Even when I wanted to quit." Charles smiled proudly. "Then you've earned the next door." Darryl felt his pulse quicken. "What happens now?" Charles stepped out of the way and pushed open a door he'd kept closed all week. Inside was a room with 3 desks, a whiteboard, and a sign on the wall. Rendell Leadership Apprenticeship Program. Darryl blinked. "Is this?" "Yes," Charles said. "The real beginning." Darryl stepped in slowly. He felt it. His life was changing. He wasn't the same man who walked into that diner. He wasn't even the same man he was 7 days ago. This was something new. Something earned. Something he was ready for. The room felt different from the rest of Rendell Innovations, not because it was fancier, but because it felt purposeful. Focused. The air itself seemed to hum with ambition. 3 desks sat neatly arranged, each paired with a small stack of books, a notepad, and a printed card labeled Leadership Apprentice, Cohort 12. Darryl stared at the card, confused. Cohort 12. You mean there were 11 others before me? Charles nodded. Not everyone who receives the notebook gets here. But those who do? Their lives change forever. Darryl stepped deeper into the room, fingertips brushing the smooth surface of the desk that was now his. A swirl of disbelief and pride churned inside him. So what exactly is this program? Charles folded his arms and leaned against the doorframe. It's a year-long apprenticeship. You'll shadow different teams, learn how real businesses operate, develop financial literacy, communication, leadership, and discipline. You'll work harder than you ever have, but you'll grow faster than you can imagine. Darryl exhaled slowly. And at the end? At the end, Charles said, you'll have options. A job here if you want it. A recommendation to any company in the city if you don't. Or if you've got the fire, you'll be ready to start something of your own. Something warm and powerful rose in Darryl's chest. I don't know what to say. You don't need to say anything yet. Charles motioned for him to sit. Today is just orientation. Darryl sat. His heart thudded against his ribs. Charles placed a folder in front of him. Before we begin, there's something you need to understand. The notebook wasn't the secret. Darryl blinked. It wasn't. No, Charles smiled. The notebook was the test. He pulled another object from his briefcase, a heavier, leather-bound book, dark brown and embossed with gold lettering. Darryl's eyebrows lifted. What's that? This, Charles said, placing the book onto the desk with reverence, is the real secret. The cover read, The Framework of Self-Made Leaders. Darryl reached out, hesitated, then opened the book carefully. Inside were detailed systems, strategies, and lessons, not vague motivational lines, but real tools. There were diagrams on decision-making, chapters on negotiation, formulas for setting and achieving goals, methods for building influence, scripts for difficult conversations, financial principles, and even a 12-week startup blueprint. The kind of knowledge people paid thousands of dollars to learn. Darryl's breath caught. Why give this to me? Charles smiled lightly. Because you proved something this week, that you have discipline, humility, and hunger. That combination is rare. He leaned forward. And because someone once trusted me when I had nothing. Now it's my turn to trust someone. Darryl felt his throat tighten. He looked down at the book again. The weight of it felt like a responsibility, and an opportunity. "Thank you," he whispered. "You earned it," Charles said. "Now let's get to work." The transformation begins. The first day wasn't flashy. No groundbreaking moment. No dramatic scene. Just steady, meaningful work. Learning how to track daily goals. Observing team meetings. Practicing clear communication. Breaking down problems into actionable steps. Studying leadership concepts. But every task felt like a brick added to a foundation he never had before. Throughout the day, Charles checked in occasionally, offering advice, correcting mistakes, and pushing Darryl harder than he was comfortable with. "Don't just write what you want to achieve," he said at one point. "Write what you're willing to sacrifice." "Knowing what you want is easy," he said later. "Knowing your weaknesses is harder." Each lesson felt like a new doorway opening in Darryl's mind. By evening, he was exhausted, drained mentally, not physically. But it was a good exhaustion. The kind that meant progress. Weeks turned into months. Darryl didn't quit this time. He didn't freeze. He didn't run. He grew. He became the most reliable apprentice, arriving early, leaving late, learning fast. His confidence sharpened. His mindset shifted. And for the first time since childhood, he looked forward to the future instead of fearing it. His mother noticed the change in his voice when he visited. Elise noticed when she said, "You carry yourself like someone in charge now." The team noticed when they began asking for his input. And Charles noticed every time Darryl pushed past discomfort and into growth. 1 year later. On a warm spring morning, almost exactly 1 year after he walked into that diner with nothing, Darryl stood in the same conference room where Charles first showed him the black notebook. Except now, Charles handed him a different item. A key. Darryl looked down at it. "What's this?" "It's the key to your office," Charles said. "My office." "You're ready," Charles replied. "You're no longer an apprentice. Starting today, you're officially a junior operations manager." Darryl felt the room spin. Him? A manager? A year ago he had no job, no home, no direction. Charles put a hand on his shoulder. "You didn't just change your life. You rebuilt it?" Darryl swallowed hard. "I don't know how to thank you." "You already did," Charles said. "By not giving up." "The real secret?" As they walked out of the room, Darryl paused. "Charles, earlier you said the notebook wasn't the secret. And the leadership book wasn't the secret either. So what is the real secret?" Charles smiled. "The real secret," he said gently, "is that everything you needed was already inside you. I just showed you how to find it." Darryl exhaled shakily, emotion swelling in his chest. He understood now. He had walked in with nothing. But he had left with the most powerful thing a person could carry. A new version of himself.